New York isn't just losing patience, it's losing people. Panicked New Yorkers are fleeing in droves now that Mamdani is mayor. And before Zoran Mamdani has even taken the oath, his victory is already triggering an exodus so real, it's reshaping the map. Florida's real estate market seeing a $100 million boom overnight as wealthy New Yorkers rush to reposition themselves, their assets, and their future. They're not waiting for policy. They're not waiting for speeches. They're moving their tax residency, shifting their filings, and quietly preparing for a city they no longer trust to protect their wealth. If a mayor-elect can cause this much motion before day one, what happens when his policies actually begin? The numbers don't lie. They reveal the fracture line spreading under New York's feet. Florida's real estate market jumping by a reported $100 million isn't just a headline, it's a migration pattern drawn in capital. The debate on television insisted that wealthy people are not going to leave, that a 2% income tax hike wouldn't make a dent. But the ground reality contradicts that confidence. Because the wealthy don't relocate buildings, they relocate tax filings. Their penthouses may sit over Manhattan, but the ownership lies in trusts and LLCs, and nothing stops a person from switching their tax residency to Florida or Texas while their New York assets stay right where they are. What does that mean on the ground? It means the building remains in New York City, consuming city services, but the taxes tied to the person behind that building no longer flow into the city budget. It means an economy still carrying the weight of the property, but losing the lifeblood of high-income revenue. It means the appearance of stability, masking a silent erosion underneath. And then there's the psychological layer. People are leaving now because they have trust issues with the new mayor. In a city where confidence drives investment, trust isn't an abstract emotion, it's an economic indicator. And right now, it's falling. Because if residents are already fleeing before any law is passed, what happens when sentiment fully turns? The trajectory is already bending, and it's bending away from New York. When insiders warn that people are leaving now because they have trust issues with the new mayor, they're not talking about fear of policy, they're talking about fear of intention. And in markets built on confidence, sentiment becomes its own economic force. That force has a name. Sentiment drag the slow, grinding pull created when emotion shapes behavior faster than legislation ever could. Here, the drag starts with uncertainty. A mayor-elect whose tone, history, and ideology divide the city before he even steps into office. Perception turns into hesitation. Hesitation turns into withdrawals. And withdrawals turn into real-world movement from tax status changes to asset repositioning to families quietly planning exits. What happens next is predictable. When investors sense instability, they stop building. When residents sense volatility, they stop spending. And when the wealthy sense risk, they don't argue, they leave. A city can survive higher taxes, tighter regulation, even political swings, but it cannot survive a collapse in trust. Because once confidence evaporates, every sector feels it. Housing, transport, business investment, and the tax base that keeps them alive. Which brings us to the question New York can't avoid anymore. Where did this storm actually begin, in policy or in perception? Every political shift creates noise, but this one created a rupture. And it didn't start with taxes or housing, it started with perception. The moment Zoran Mamdani stepped into the spotlight, critics didn't just challenge his policies, they challenged his identity, his voice, even the story of where he came from. Viral clips questioned why he spoke in different accents, why he referenced a worldwide press tour from his earlier years as a rapper in a Disney movie directed by his mother. To many New Yorkers, it didn't feel like harmless biography. It felt like a mismatch between the city they know and the persona now leading it. Then came the deeper cut. The debate around Uganda, civil rights, freedom of speech, corruption, and the idea that Mamdani was criticizing America more than he credited it. Commentators argued that earlier waves of immigrants came here because they loved this country, contrasting them with what they see as Mamdani's combative tone toward American culture and institutions. Whether fair or not, it shaped a powerful narrative, a leader who doesn't reflect the values of the city he governs. And perception metastasized into fear when his policies entered the conversation, doubling fines, tripling penalties, freezing rents, and threatening to take over buildings if landlords couldn't afford repairs. To residents and property owners already stretched thin, it sounded less like reform and more like a slow slide into state control. When rhetoric collides with policy, sentiment hardens, And hardened sentiment always seeks proof, which New Yorkers found across the city's own housing system. The warning stopped being theoretical the moment New Yorkers looked at the city's own housing empire and saw what government ownership already looks like. In Mamdani vision, if a landlord can't afford major repairs, the city will step in, fix the problem, send the bill, and if the owner can't pay, the city takes the building. Critics called it a slow transition into government housing. But New Yorkers didn't need imagination. They had NYC. At the Mitchell houses, the collapse was literal. A chimney shaft over the boiler room fell apart more than 5 weeks earlier, forcing residents to rely on a temporary system for heat and hot water. Gas for cooking? Still out. And when the media tried to attend a meeting demanding answers, the door slammed shut. No media, the manager ordered, locking out reporters and tenant advocates. It was a perfect snapshot of a system already stretched beyond repair. And one resident described in painful detail, "I ain't got no heat." A woman wrapped in a winter jacket inside her own apartment. Another, "I don't have no crockpot." A teacher forced to live off takeout because her stove is dead. Families shivering from morning to late afternoon, waiting for warmth that never arrives. NYC holds more buildings than any government in America, and many of them look like this. Broken infrastructure, delayed repairs, residents left in the cold while agencies argue about partners, asbestos testing, and public safety protocols. To critics, this isn't a cautionary tale. It's a preview, and they're asking the question New York doesn't want to face. If the city can't manage the buildings it already owns, what happens when it takes even more? What's unfolding isn't just political tension, it's a structural fault line cutting through housing, infrastructure, and the city's economic backbone. Mamdani's proposal to freeze rents while simultaneously demanding expensive renovations traps property owners in an impossible equation. Materials are rising, labor is rising, maintenance costs are rising, but revenue is locked. The city offers a solution. It will pay for the repairs and then take the building if the owner can't reimburse them. To critics, that isn't reform. It's a pipeline, one that funnels private property into government hands over time. And here's the collision. New York City already owns more apartments than any other government in America, and those buildings are failing. The Mitchell houses case wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom. When residents can't cook, can't get gas, can't get reliable heat or hot water, the promise of affordable housing becomes just another cold room with a broken boiler. If these are the conditions under existing public ownership, expanding that model doesn't fix the crisis, it scales it. From a structural standpoint, each takeover worsens the financial strain. More buildings mean more maintenance, more emergency repairs, more lawsuits, more outages, all at a time when the tax base is already eroding. Add in deteriorating transit systems, bus safety concerns, subway fare evasion, and a $452 million MTA shortfall, and the cracks widen. New York isn't just facing policy missteps, it's facing system overload. Because when housing infrastructure buckles, it doesn't stop there. It drags the entire urban economy with it straight into the next domino. When people talk about decline, they usually think of headlines or politics. But the real damage appears in numbers, the quiet kind. The kind that shows up in payrolls, budgets, and missing tax receipts. New York's economy runs on a simple reality. 1% of residents pay nearly 50% of the city's taxes. And those are the same people critics warn can leave yesterday, often literally, with private jets and tax attorneys who can relocate filings in a single afternoon. Once those taxpayers shift residency to Florida or Texas, the consequences are immediate. Their properties remain in New York, consuming services, demanding infrastructure, but the income tied to those owners now flows into another state's budget. That turns a city of 8 million into a city carrying dead weight. Buildings without corresponding revenue, assets without the taxpayers who fund roads, policing, transit, and schools. The jobs ripple is just as sharp. When confidence falls, high-income earners stop investing, developers stop building, landlords halt repairs, and companies scale back hiring. Service workers, the backbone of New York's daily life, are the first to feel it. Every building that slips into dysfunction means lost maintenance jobs. Every stalled project means fewer contractors. Every luxury buyer who files taxes elsewhere means less fuel for the retail, dining, and entertainment sectors that depend on their spending. And as housing weakens, the MTA shortfall widens, and city services strain under aging infrastructure, GDP drag becomes inevitable. Money hasn't vanished. It's migrated, following the people who no longer believe the city protects their future. Because when the tax whales swim south, the tide they leave behind pulls the entire city down with them. While New York debates ideology, other states are quietly collecting its revenue. Florida and Texas aren't just alternatives, they're competitors perfectly positioned to receive the very residents New York is pushing away. And they don't need to move skyscrapers or penthouses to do it. All they need is the paperwork. A tax residency change, a trust adjustment, an LLC update. Overnight, millions in taxable income stop flowing to New York's budget and start fueling someone else's. What makes these states so effective is the contrast. Where New York talks about doubling fines, tripling penalties, freezing rents, and seizing buildings, Florida markets sunshine, deregulation, and predictability. Where New York fights over subway fares and MTA shortfalls, Texas advertises lower taxes, new corporate hubs, and vast room to grow. And for wealthy residents watching the political storm build, the choice feels less like relocation and more like self-preservation. This shift doesn't happen in headlines, it happens in habits. Once families enroll their kids in new schools, once entrepreneurs move their LLCs, once retirees file their tax returns elsewhere, those choices harden. The longer they stay, the less likely they return. That's how cities lose not just people, but generations. For New York, the competition is already underway. The question now is whether the city adjusts or doubles down. Because if confidence continues to erode, if infrastructure continues to slip, and if political rhetoric keeps overshadowing economic reality, the next test may not come from policy, but from the calendar. A series of high-stakes events are approaching, and they could become the ultimate stress test for a city already stretched thin. Every city faces pressure, but only a few face moments when the world is watching, moments where perception becomes destiny. For New York, that window is approaching fast. Even without a global event on the calendar, the city is entering a period where every weakness becomes visible. Transit strain, housing breakdowns, rising disorder, and a tax base quietly thinning out. When officials float ideas like free buses, the governor counters instantly. The MTA is staring at a $452 million shortfall. And fare evasion is already rampant. If subways can't secure revenue today, how will they absorb more riders tomorrow? Then there's the broader public mood. Viral clips showing confrontations on buses and platforms chip away at the city's credibility as a functional metropolis. If people are already avoiding transit, if landlords are bracing for rent freezes, and if buildings are one repair away from government takeover, what happens when pressure spikes? What happens when outages coincide with winter storms? When budget gaps collide with rising costs? Or when political promises meet operational reality? This is what critics fear, that New York's most fragile systems could face their biggest stress test at the exact moment confidence is collapsing. A window like this determines narrative. If services falter, the story becomes decline. If infrastructure buckles, the story becomes incompetence. And once that story hardens, it spreads to investors, families, corporations, and the very residents the city can't afford to lose. New York is entering a season where every misstep compounds, and every delay amplifies the sense that the city is no longer in control. Which brings us to the final question. What choice does New York make now? New York has reached a fork in the road, one defined not by ideology, but by consequences. The warnings have already materialized in the form of fleeing residents, strained infrastructure, shuttered meetings, freezing apartments, and a tax base quietly draining south. The city can no longer afford to assume resilience will happen automatically. Resilience is a choice, and right now, it's slipping. If New York wants to recover, it needs to rebuild the one currency it's been losing fastest: trust. Trust from property owners who fear seizure. Trust from residents who can't get heat or gas. Trust from commuters who no longer feel safe in the system that's supposed to move them. Trust from the very taxpayers whose departure could hollow out the city's future. Without that trust, every policy, whether it promises compassion, fairness, or reform, becomes another reason for people to leave. The alternative is grim. If the city doubles down on policies critics see as punitive, if rent freezes collide with infrastructure decay, if building takeovers expand while existing public housing collapses, then New York risks accelerating a cycle it cannot reverse. Because money doesn't vanish, it moves. And once it moves far enough, it doesn't come back. So the choice becomes simple and brutal. Will New York remain a city people invest in or a city people escape from? Will it course correct before confidence is gone for good? Or will it let sentiment drag turn into structural decline? And if you were living in this storm, would you stay or would you leave? If you believe New York is on the edge of a deeper transformation or a deeper crisis, tell me in the comments. And if you want more investigations into the stories reshaping America, make sure to subscribe. The next chapter is already unfolding.